Hello, thank you for your attention. I wanted to create a video to get people thinking on thinking I was thinking. How good do people think these days? How many people have critical thinking? This is what I found out. On average, how many people are critical thinkers in the United States? Best estimate. About 10 to 15% of Americans can be considered true critical thinkers based on rigorous skill assessment, despite the fact that over 90% of the population believes that critical thinking is important. Surveys consistently show that most Americans fail basic critical thinking assessments, and only a small minority consistently engage in behaviors such as challenging their own opinions, evaluating evidence, and seeking out alternative viewpoints. Key findings. Approximately 10% of Americans meet the criteria for strong, active critical thinking skills, as opposed to just believing they possess them. Surveys reveal that 94% consider critical thinking very important, but around 86% see those skills as lacking in the general public. Testing shows that most adults fall short. About 69% of Americans fail basic critical thinking and digital literacy quizzes, and less than a quarter regularly seek out views that challenge their beliefs. About 13 to 15% demonstrate genuinely proficient or satisfactory critical thinking in formal assessments. Practice and education. While nearly all Americans value critical thinking, ongoing education gaps and social media challenges have led to only a minority maintaining and improving these skills. Only about 1/4 routinely debate people with different views, a core aspect of critical thinking practice. In summary, the best estimate suggests that between 1 in 10 and 1 in 7 Americans are active, proficient critical thinkers, with the rest often overestimating their abilities or not applying these skills in daily life. Trends in U.S. critical thinking rates over the past 20 years. Over the past 20 years, the percentage of Americans demonstrating strong critical thinking skills has remained consistently low, with little to no widespread improvement despite growing awareness of the importance of these skills. In fact, public perception of the lack of critical thinking has grown, and recent surveys suggest that many Americans believe society is doing a poor job of cultivating these abilities. Long-term trends. Surveys from 2005 to 2025 indicate that while support for teaching and valuing critical thinking remains extremely high, around 95% of respondents, only a small minority of Americans report having received strong critical thinking training, and most do not actively practice these skills in daily life. There has been a slight increase in awareness and demand for critical thinking education, with more people believing it should be taught in schools and at younger ages. The actual rate of proficient critical thinkers appears stagnant, currently estimated at around 10 to 15%, with many reporting that their skills either plateau or deteriorate after high school. Contributing factors. Technology, social norms, and flaws in the education system are commonly blamed for the continued deficit in critical thinking. The rise of misinformation, digital distractions, and polarized media have further complicated the landscape for developing authentic reasoning skills, with information overload cited as an increasingly important obstacle in recent years. While research and educational initiatives on critical thinking have increased, especially post-2020, there is little evidence that these efforts have resulted in a substantial jump in actual critical thinking rates across the general population. Generational and educational patterns. College-level longitudinal studies show wide variance in skill levels among students, and many experience cognitive fatigue and a drop in reasoning during times of crisis, e.g., COVID-19 pandemic. K-12 education data shows some localized improvements, but uneven results across districts and states, with many students still falling short of proficient critical thinking benchmarks by graduation. In summary, despite increases in awareness and demand, actual critical thinking rates in the United States have not meaningfully improved over the past 20 years and remain a serious concern for educators and society. When was America at the peak for critical thinkers? There is no definitive, statistically documented peak era when the majority of Americans were strong critical thinkers. But available research and expert opinion suggest that critical thinking rates in the US have never been especially high among the general public. Many experts believe that critical thinking was promoted most energetically in schools and universities during the mid-20th century, especially between the 1930s and 1960s, as part of progressive educational reforms inspired by John Dewey and others. However, even then, these skills were generally fostered among educated elites and were not widespread in broader society. Historical perspectives. Progressive education experiments in the 1930s, 1960s placed great emphasis on teaching reflective and critical thought in select schools, but these efforts did not permeate all American classrooms or communities. By the 1950s, educational theorists believed America was leading world efforts in critical thinking education. Yet critiques point out that effective teaching and absorption of these skills remained relatively rare outside academic and intellectual circles. In recent decades, rising awareness has not translated into greater proficiency, and some experts argue that mass media and technology have steadily eroded authentic reasoning and discourse. No documented mass peak. Available longitudinal data do not show a clear time when critical thinking rates reached a national high. Instead, most assessments indicate long-term stagnation and possibly a decline over the past several decades. Narratives about a golden age for American critical thinking are largely anecdotal and reflect nostalgia for educational reforms, but not actual population-wide mastery. In summary, while mid-20th century education policy promoted critical thinking with greatest intensity, the actual rate of proficient critical thinkers among Americans has always been relatively low, and there is no historical period with evidence of a real nationwide peak. What do you predict the future of U.S. citizens' critical thinking will be? Most forecasts suggest that unless the U.S. education system, media environment, and cultural attitudes make substantial reforms, the average critical thinking skills among American citizens will likely remain stagnant or decline further in the next decade. The digital information overload, polarized social media, and emphasis on quick answers over deep reasoning continue to erode opportunities for authentic critical thought. However, there are pockets of optimism. Targeted educational programs, select colleges, and workplaces that invest in critical thinking are showing positive results at the local level, with specific training techniques able to raise analytical abilities meaningfully in those groups. Businesses and educators are increasingly aware that critical thinking will be even more essential due to the rise of AI, automation, and complex global challenges, suggesting new efforts to promote these skills in professional settings. Predictions for the next decade. Without major reforms, general critical thinking rates may continue to stagnate or decline, especially amid ongoing digital distractions and cultural polarization. Focused training in businesses and advanced education can produce isolated improvements, potentially expanding the critical thinking gap between high achievers and the broader public. Artificial intelligence and technology will make superficial information easier to access, putting greater pressure on citizens to develop deep evaluative and reasoning skills to thrive socially and professionally. Calls for curriculum changes and early childhood intervention are increasing, and if widely adopted, could slowly improve rates among the next generation. Overall, strong critical thinkers may remain a minority unless there is broad, intentional change in how Americans are taught, incentivized, and expected to use reasoning skills in everyday life. Thank you all for your time and thoughtful attention. Engaging in honest reflection and open dialogue is essential for any community striving to improve its understanding and resilience. To keep your mind sharp, consider this critical thinking question. When you read or hear a news story, how do you determine whether the information is reliable? What steps could you take to avoid bias and reach a well-supported conclusion? Wishing everyone continued growth in thoughtful inquiry and reasoned conversation.